And welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Walsh, the military reporter for KPBS, and I'm delighted to be moderating this Q&A from our virtual screening room, better known as your house. I want to introduce our panelists. Joining us is the director of She Wore Silver Wings, Devin Scott. We also have the director and producing team for In Their Own Words, Denton Atkinson and Brian Williams. Also here is Paulette Mello. She's the vice president of the San Diego chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen. Welcome to all of you. I want to
Thank you.
remind so I want to remind our audience that you can submit questions for our panel through the online forum located just below your video window on your virtual screening room page. So let's while you're checking that out, let's get started here. So Devin Scott, I wanted to talk to you about your great aunt. How is she doing right now?
Actually, Jean is doing fantastic. She just turned 102 on Monday, and unfortunately, the coronavirus is kind of keeping, the people locked down a little bit, so she didn't get to have the big blowout that she deserves. But there was a nice little card chain that going on, so she did get hundreds of cards and letters from people, so she really did feel appreciated.
So how did she handle all of the publicity that came out after the film? Did she like the film, I guess is the first question.
Well, it was a very personal film. History is really told by the people who lived it, and her story is quite similar to other women that had the experience. But it was from her very personal point of view. So when it was done, the first time I showed it to her, she was crying, and she said, "Well, you're not going to show this to anyone, are you?" But she actually has become quite a bit of a celebrity, and has been traveling and spent quite a bit of time actually going to schools and lecturing about the wasps, and it really invigorated the last few years of her life.
So did she ever end up being able to fly after she left the Wasps?
She did fly a little bit. She took a job ferrying these old dilapidated World War I biplanes going off to surplus, but she almost died in one of them, and she just said, this is not really what I want to do. So she decided to go back to teaching. And really, there wasn't very much opportunity for women pilots at all. The first commercial female pilot was, I think, not until 1976. So they really just nobody thought, even after the war, that women could fly. And unfortunately, it took a long time to break those barriers.
Yeah, these two films are really tie in well together because they're two just nearly forgotten aspects of World War II. Two groups who contributed a tremendous amount to the war effort, but for years received no recognition whatsoever. And in the case of women pilots, I mean, their story was so forgotten that what I was reading up that in 1976, when the U.S. Air Force announced that they were finally going to allow women pilots, the Air Force had a press release where they said that these were the first women to fly for the Air Force. And that is one of the things that really triggered the WASP, saying that they were upset that somehow that nobody had even remembered that they had been doing this during the war. Um, how did your great aunt feel about this? Did she feel like she was kind of lost to history for a long time?
Yeah, she really did feel that way, and she was. She showed me this certificate that she got in the mail after 35 years, and at first I didn't really realize what I was looking at because it was just this tiny piece of paper. And I had expected that you would get some sort of a big plaque or thank you, or she said nothing accompanied this, no letter, no thank you, just this little piece of paper in the mail. It was like the minimal they could do to acknowledge it, which, so she still, even after it was acknowledged, she didn't feel like she was really appreciated until, the Obama gave them the Congressional Gold Medal.
So I really like the way you started the film, where you're basically showing photos of you at holiday tables. You're sitting across from her as a little kid. Was she just full of stories? Is this how you learned about the wasps?
Oh yeah, I mean, growing up with a pilot who, man or woman, telling these amazing stories of, how she, would basically just take a map and a compass and say, head east, and eventually she would end up in Newark, New Jersey. I mean, sometimes it would take a week and a half to 2 weeks to fly these planes. Back then they didn't have radar, they didn't have any kind of GPS. It was just kind of, if you hit a storm, go north or go south until you find a place to land. And it was pretty amazing that she did this for 2 years, 7 days a week. It was pretty amazing.
And this was potentially dangerous work. I think 38 female pilots did lose their lives flying these
routes. It was dangerous. A lot of times they would give them the worst planes to do a lot of their tasks were training, where they would have to tow a target where the men would shoot at it with these giant guns. And they always gave them the worst planes, or the planes that had the worst maintenance. And so that, there was quite a few terrible accidents. I mean, they were all accidents but it was very, very sad.
And the film makes reference to the sabotage, cut rudders, sugar in the gas tank, sand in the transmission. Who was doing the sabotage? Was it Nazis, or were these men on the base that didn't like the idea of seeing these women up in the air?
Yeah, it was men, actually. The military at the time really thought there was no place for women in the military, period. And here these women were thrust upon them. It was really worse. The worst place was Camp Davis up in North Carolina, and the commander of that base basically told the women that you and the planes are expendable, and they wouldn't let them fly when they were menstruating, because they thought that women were gonna, the Army called it debilitating irrationality is what the Army called it. I mean, so they just faced a lot of sexual discrimination at the time.
The full list of prejudice were on display during the whole time. So I want to turn to our second film here. In their own words, we have Denton Atkinson and Brian Williams. Support for the war was not especially high among African Americans. I mean, the idea of fighting Nazis and racism, but just in Europe, but not the racism in America, really kind of didn't sit well with a lot of people. In fact, I think Frank Capra was charged with making a documentary to bolster support by featuring mainly the wartime accomplishments of African Americans through history. Did the men that you interviewed, did they talk at all about like where their patriotism came from and why they even wanted to be pilots during World War II?
Well, Lee Archer, one of the airmen featured, it's interesting. It was a little bit opposite of what you were just asking. He wanted to serve. He wanted to do something. I mean, especially because this was the big evil thing coming. So he tells a story about where he had to tell his father he was going off to fight. His father served with the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, and it was horrible for them. They had to fight in Europe. And so when Lee went off, he had to break his father's heart. One of the stories you don't hear is he says when he got in that bus, and him and his best friend was a white guy, they came down to the Mason-Dixon line where they stopped and said, okay, all the blacks to the back of the bus. And he's like, what? Because he's from New York. And so he pointed at the White House. He said, when I get my plane, the first building I'm bombing is that one. And his friend said, okay, let's calm down. But he went on to serve with distinction and serve, and his father lived into the civil rights movement. So his father told him, you did this. And so he got to see his father proud of him. And he said that was the biggest accomplishment he had in the entire serving in the military. And because they did make a difference. So
yeah, and on that thought, a lot of the guys that we interviewed, there was a great sense of patriotism. There were a few that said, well, we're going to get drafted, so why not make the best of it? And flying sounds like a lot of fun. So there were, of course, those guys, and Colonel McGee, or General McGee now, had said that he knew he was going to be fighting. He wanted to fight, but he said, sitting in a cockpit was probably going to be a little better than sitting in a foxhole with a rifle and mud and bullets flying around you and everything. And everybody that we interviewed said we fell in love with it and wanted to be the best that we could possibly be.
Yeah. And I don't think people realize, but with World War II, we think of that as the greatest generation and everyone volunteering for the war effort. But of all of the wars of the 20th century, it's actually World War II that has the highest percentage of draftees and the fewest volunteers by percentage. Of course, millions of people were involved, but still by percentage. Most people were drafted to go in there. So it's some of this is just a matter of like looking at where they can do something that can help themselves as well as be a part of the war effort. So Paulette, you get to spend some time with Tuskegee Airmen, which seems like kind of a cool thing to do. How many folks are left at this point, though?
Out of the 953 pilots, I believe about 10 are still around. And then, but they had over 16,000 crewmen and women, but there's not an exact count on them. But they're well up in their age. But here locally in San Diego, we have Mr. Nelson Robinson still left with us. He's 93 years young and still sharp as a tack. So we're just very blessed to have him with us.
And what do they see as their legacy at this point, all these years later?
Right. They see, I was telling the gentleman earlier that they are still humble, that they just want to show that they fought the fight to defend America. This is their land. So, and they want to see that legacy carried on in future generations. And also just the excellence that they strove for, that General Benjamin O. Davis, he told them to do that. So, and they want to teach children and youth to do that as well. So
we have a couple of questions here from the audience. We have Edward Martin. Did anyone know my late uncle, a Tuskegee Airman, Robert L. Martin? Is that a name that came up anywhere? Raise your hand if you got a story.
I didn't know him.
Okay.
No, we didn't know him.
Sorry, Edward. Another question for Paulette, though. I heard that there were women who weren't allowed to be in the WASPs, so they went to Tuskegee to fly. Women like Janet Harmon Bragg. Is that the case where even amongst the WASP, they face some discrimination?
yes, and actually it was Mildred Carter. She was the first African-American lady. She went to Tuskegee. She got her private license there. And she was trained by Chief Anderson, who taught the airmen. He actually took Eleanor Roosevelt up, because she was a great proponent of the Tuskegee and also the WASP. So they unfortunately didn't allow women to fly. So, but they, still established and got a private pilot license, excuse me. Yes.
All right, so let's see, a question for Devin here. Did you uncover any other stories of the WASP or the WAFs since the film was released? So what have you learned since there, Devin?
To be honest, I really haven't learned too much. This film was very personal, so I just kind of dealt with my aunt on it, and she, told her stories. She did tell every time we would go to a film festival or something, and she'd be up on stage, she would come off with some news story that I'd never even heard of, So I did record those stories, and so I do have those as well. But it's a chapter of history that I think needs to be preserved. So
there has to be a tremendous sense of urgency right now to get these stories down, especially if folks are still active and excited and able to tell those stories. So I wanted to kind of bring this back to today, and let's talk about some of the unfinished legacy here. Today, I think it's 4% of commercial pilots are women, 3% are African-American. And the statistics for the military really aren't much better. I think 2% of Navy pilots are African-American. Air Force, just 2% of officers are Black pilots. It still seems like even after everything they went through, and even after these attempts to revive this rich legacy, in many ways, both of these groups are still on the outside looking in. Who'd like to take that one first?
Charles Dryden, probably one of the most famous of the airmen, we interviewed very early on. In the room we were interviewing him, next door there was a teenager shot while we were interviewing him. And we kind of found out what in the world's going on. And he heard it, and he just sunk down in his chair. I think he was 87 years old at the time, right? And sitting in his wheelchair. And he said, we're trying so hard to get inner city kids into airplanes, because if they can get above their surroundings, they can see how little this is, how very small this little turf or this little area is that they feel is so important. and they can understand there's a much bigger role in society for them. And I know that for the airmen, a lot, the ones we talked to, they really wanted kids to be really excited about this. So a lot of these programs have started where some of the schools are having flight training and stuff like that. But it was so interesting that that happened while we were talking to him, and you could see he just didn't want to get, he died a few months later, but he didn't want to go anywhere until he knew like that little girl was okay and that she had a chance to see above where she felt was very important, if that makes sense.
And may I chime
Well,
in also? Thank
yes.
you. That's what our chapter is under the branch of Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, and they're based out of Tuskegee, Alabama. And that is our goal also, is to encourage youth in education, aerospace, STEM education. And we have a youth programs, annual scholarships, encouraging, ground school and whatnot, because actually our chapter here in San Diego was going to implement that this year, but thanks to COVID, we're going to have to table it till next year. So, and that is our one of our main action items, is getting youth involved in aviation and aerospace.
So what do you think? Is it a matter of that youth themselves, young African Americans, young women don't want to do this? Or is it a matter of these services that, have had a legacy of not being particularly welcome, still in some ways are not as welcoming to women and African Americans?
Right.
Well, when you listen to one part and in their own words, Colonel Jefferson is talking about he would sneak off and watch the planes fly. He'd sneak off to the little Air Force Base, or not Air Force Base, but kind of what's the airstrip? Yeah. So he would watch it. And he would kind of see that in his, like, he's the one that pushed very hard to be able to do this. So I do think kids should be excited about it. But how many inner city kids see airplanes or get to get in an airplane?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think it starts there because the airmen told me that. So.
Right. And if I may also tag on to that, like myself, I wanted to be the first Black female Blue Angel because, my studies was aviation and aerospace. But then I didn't have any mentors. So I never followed through because I didn't know, who do I ask? Who do I look up to? Because there was none, So yeah, that has to change.
Yeah. Is that mentorship there now, do you think?
I think it is, but it does need to increase. Thankfully, now with social media, which I didn't have when I was growing up, I think that helps as well. So, and definitely outreach opportunities.
Devin, did your great aunt, did she stay involved at all? I mean, she's lived a long life. She was there for the women's movement in the 60s and the 70s. Did she stay active? Did she stay a part of that even beyond her own service?
She went back to teaching after after she stopped flying, but she has kept abreast of what's going on. I mean, she got excited when they had the first female commander of a space shuttle mission. She just got to witness the first all-female spacewalk. I mean, so and over the years she's had many women who have flown in combat that have heard her story and have come up and thanked her for what she did, breaking some barriers for them. So on a personal level, she really she's very humble about what she did, but she does feel that that she has made a difference, and she sees these things where women have made these steps, and it makes her feel good.
Do young women want to talk to her? Do they want to talk to Tuskegee Airmen who are approaching 100? I mean, do they still relate to these stories?
From what we've seen, yeah, from the events that we've done and conversations we've had with the airmen, there's always kids that come up. And I know a lot of the airmen that we talk to have, within the last few years, have slowed down with it, but going in and talking to kids in schools, doing that direct outreach. And one of the common, Paulette, you can probably attest to this as well, that when we were doing the documentary, the airmen called themselves the trailblazers.
Yes.
And they said, we're the ones who started the ball rolling, and it's next to these kids, and then the kids next to them, and the generations to keep going, to keep this flame alive that keeps their story going, what they accomplished, what they sacrificed, and ultimately inspire youth to keep going with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You
I
know, you're
concur.
dealing with some pretty amazing people when the airmen refer to Martin Luther King Jr. as that kid that came up that changed the world.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's where we're gonna have to end it. I want to thank you for joining us this evening and being part of this first ever GI Film Festival San Diego virtual showcase. A special thanks to all involved for making the showcase possible, including our advisory committee members, the staff at KPBS, and the Film Consortium San Diego, and our festival sponsors, which include the California Arts Council and Scatina Daniels Communications. In the email reminder for this screening, there was a link to our attendee survey. It takes just a couple minutes to fill out. You can help us make the 2021 GI Film Festival San Diego event better than ever. The full festival and juried film competition takes place May 18th through the 23rd in 2021. We hope to see all of you there. Our virtual screening continues tonight at 7 o'clock with No Greater Love by director Justin Roberts. He'll be there for a virtual screening room Q&A with KPBS Evening Edition host Maya Trabulsi. So join us there. And again, thanks all of you, and good night.